war veteran married mute town girl for silence. She spoke that night and changed his world. When Thomas Garrett woke up that night, the words coming from his wife's lips would change his life forever. But before we begin this story, let's go back 24 hours. Thomas Garrett was the quietest man in Cedar Creek. After returning from the Red Cloud War in 1878, words had abandoned him. His ears, which echoed with the sound of bombs, couldn't forget his friends' final screams. The crack of rifles, the dying gasps of his fellow soldiers, the way Sergeant Murphy had called for his mother with his last breath. These sounds haunted Thomas day and night. He was 41 years old. His hair had turned white early from trauma rather than age. And his hands constantly trembled from what the army doctors called soldier's heart. The nightmares came every few hours, jerking him awake with cold sweats and a racing pulse. He lived alone on his small ranch 5 miles outside town, only coming down to Cedar Creek for necessary shopping and supplies. Talking to people was torture for him, because every voice, every laugh, every sudden sound brought back war memories that felt as fresh as yesterday. The townspeople had grown accustomed to Thomas's silence. They remembered the bright, talkative young man who had left for war 3 years ago, full of patriotic fervor and dreams of glory. The hollow-eyed, trembling man who returned bore little resemblance to the boy they had known. He would nod politely when greeted, conduct his business with minimal words, and disappear back to his isolated ranch as quickly as possible. But before we continue with this video, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button, because the ending of this story will shock you completely. That Monday morning when Thomas went down to town, he saw an unusual crowd gathered outside the general store. Everyone was talking about Sarah Whitmore. The 28-year-old woman was known as the town's heaviest and most silent resident, a fixture in Cedar Creek who seemed as permanent and overlooked as the old oak tree in the town square. Sarah's story was a painful one that everyone thought they knew. After a fever she contracted as a child, she had supposedly lost her ability to speak. At least that's what everyone believed. Her mother had died in childbirth with Sarah's younger brother, who had also perished. Her father, overwhelmed by grief and responsibility, had abandoned her when she was just 12 years old, leaving her in the care of Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house proprietor who took her in more out of Christian duty than affection. Sarah weighed 200 pounds, her body soft and round, in an era when such size was often seen as either a sign of prosperity or, more commonly among women, a mark of failure to maintain proper feminine restraint. She moved through town like a ghost, always dressed in simple, dark clothing that seemed designed to help her disappear into the background. The town women would whisper behind her back, saying, "Poor mute fat Sarah," with a mixture of pity and superiority that made their charitable feelings feel more like condescension. And she would sit quietly in the corner of whatever room she occupied, never reacting to the whispers, the pointed looks, or the way conversations would die when she entered. Her face remained serene and unreadable, her large hands always busy with some bit of needlework or mending that helped pay for her modest keep at the boarding house. When Thomas noticed Sarah that day, something stirred within him that had been dormant since the war. The deep silence in the woman's eyes matched the silence within him, but it was a different kind of quiet. Where his silence came from trauma and fear, hers seemed to come from acceptance and inner peace. They were both people who didn't want to speak, couldn't speak, but for entirely different reasons. He found himself studying her face as she sat in her usual corner of the general store, her large hands working steadily on what appeared to be an intricate piece of embroidery. Despite her size, her movements were graceful and precise. There was something almost meditative about the way she worked, completely absorbed in her task, oblivious to the whispers and stares around her. The town priest, Father McKenna, noticed Thomas's unusual interest and approached with the well-meaning meddling that small-town clergy often displayed. "Thomas, my son, you need a wife. This isolation isn't healthy for a man your age. Loneliness kills a person as surely as any bullet." Thomas's jaw tightened at the mention of bullets, but he forced himself to respond. "I want silence, Father. Just silence. No chatter, no questions about the war, no expectations I can't meet." Father McKenna's eyes lit up with what he clearly thought was divine inspiration. "Then Sarah Whitmore is perfect for you. The poor girl never speaks anyway. Hasn't said a word since she was 7 years old, from what I'm told. If you want a quiet home, there's no one better than her. And Lord knows she needs someone to provide for her. Mrs. Henderson's getting on in years and won't be able to keep her much longer." Thomas looked more carefully at Sarah. The woman was sitting in the corner, busy with her needlework, her heavy body filling the wooden chair, but somehow not making it look strained. Her dark dress was simple but clean and well mended, and there was indeed a peaceful expression on her round face. She seemed completely content in her silent world, unbothered by the fact that life moved around her without including her. But what struck Thomas most was the quality of her stillness. It wasn't the tense, hypervigilant stillness of a soldier expecting attack, but the settled calm of someone who had found peace with their circumstances. In a world that seemed determined to be loud and demanding, Sarah Whitmore existed in a bubble of quiet that Thomas found intensely appealing. That evening, Thomas spent considerable time preparing for what he realized would be one of the most important conversations of his adult life. He bathed, shaved carefully, and put on his best shirt, the one he'd worn to church before the war. When such things had seemed to matter, the walk to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house felt longer than usual. Each step weighted with the magnitude of what he was about to propose. The boarding house was a tired-looking 2-story building that had seen better days, its paint faded and shutters slightly askew. Mrs. Henderson answered his knock with surprise evident on her weathered face. She had known Thomas since he was a boy, and seeing him at her door after months of nodding acquaintances was clearly unexpected. "Thomas Garrett, what brings you by at this hour?" she asked, though it was barely past 7 in the evening. "I'd like to speak with Miss Whitmore, if I may. It's a matter of some importance." Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. Sarah rarely received visitors, and certainly never young men with serious expressions and carefully combed hair. But she stepped aside and called up the stairs in the way that landladies everywhere had perfected, loud enough to carry but not quite a shout. "Sarah, you have a caller." The wait seemed eternal. Thomas heard the creak of floorboards overhead, the whisper of fabric, the careful descent of footsteps on wooden stairs. When Sarah finally appeared, she was wearing her best dress, a dark blue cotton that brought out her eyes and fit her full figure respectably. Her brown hair was neatly pinned back, and Thomas noticed for the first time that she had lovely skin, clear and smooth despite her years. The woman was surprised to see him, her eyes widening slightly before settling into careful attention. Thomas realized he had never actually looked directly at her before, really looked. She was not conventionally pretty by the standards of the day, but there was something appealing about her steady gaze and the way she held herself with quiet dignity despite her size. "Miss Whitmore," Thomas began, his voice rougher than he'd intended. The formal words felt strange on his tongue after months of speaking to no one but his livestock. "I hope you'll forgive the presumption of my visit, but I have a proposition I'd like you to consider." Sarah tilted her head slightly, clearly listening with full attention. Mrs. Henderson hovered nearby, not even pretending to give them privacy. Thomas took a deep breath and forced himself to continue. "I'm in need of a wife, not for the usual reasons, you understand. I want a quiet home, a peaceful home. I've heard enough noise, enough chatter, enough demands to last several lifetimes. You, from what I understand, appreciate silence as much as I do." Sarah's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or calculation. "I have a good ranch, productive land, sufficient resources to support a family. You would want for nothing material. In return, I ask only for the gift of your silence and whatever domestic skills you might possess. I'm proposing marriage, Miss Whitmore. A marriage of mutual convenience and, I hope, mutual respect." The silence that followed felt heavy with possibility. Sarah studied his face intently, and Thomas had the unsettling feeling that she was seeing far more than he intended to reveal. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she nodded slowly and deliberately. Yes, the wedding ceremony was held on a Thursday morning in late September, attended by perhaps a dozen people who came more out of curiosity than celebration. Father McKenna performed the service with his usual gravity, though Thomas noticed the priest's eyes darting between the mismatched couple with poorly concealed fascination. Here was the silent war veteran, with his trembling hands and hollow eyes, standing beside the mute seamstress, whose generous proportions filled out her simple wedding dress with comfortable dignity. The townspeople whispered among themselves throughout the brief ceremony. Mrs. Henderson dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, though whether from sentiment or relief at seeing her longtime boarder settled, Thomas couldn't tell. Old Mr. Peterson, who ran the hardware store, kept shaking his head and muttering about strange times and what the world was coming to. But what struck Thomas most during the ceremony was Sarah herself. She stood beside him with perfect composure, her responses to the vows coming in the form of clear nods rather than spoken words. When Father McKenna pronounced them husband and wife, she looked up at Thomas with something that might have been gratitude in her dark eyes. There was no kiss. Thomas had not been able to bring himself to suggest such intimacy with a woman who was essentially a stranger, but Sarah placed her hand gently on his arm as they walked back down the short aisle. Her touch was warm and steady, and Thomas found it surprisingly comforting. The ride back to the ranch passed in their established silence, but it felt different now, less lonely, somehow. Thomas had loaded Sarah's few possessions into the wagon: 2 carpet bags containing her clothes, a wooden box of sewing supplies, a few books, and a small bundle wrapped in cloth that she handled with particular care. When he'd offered to carry it for her, she'd shaken her head and kept it close to her chest. When Thomas brought Sarah to his ranch for the first time as his wife, he watched her face carefully as she took in what would now be her home. The house was a modest 2-story structure he'd built himself before the war, when he'd still harbored dreams of filling it with children and laughter. It was well constructed, but undeniably masculine in its simplicity. Functional furniture, bare walls, windows without curtains. Sarah walked through each room methodically, her hands trailing over surfaces, testing the weight of doors, examining the quality of construction with the eye of someone who understood the difference between temporary shelter and permanent home. In the kitchen, she opened cabinets and drawers, took inventory of dishes and cookware, ran her fingers along the edges of the work surfaces. Her face revealed nothing of her thoughts, but Thomas caught her nodding slightly, as if approving of what she found. The house was orderly but cold, clearly the domain of a man who valued function over comfort. There were no softening touches, no sense that anyone had ever tried to make it beautiful rather than merely serviceable. Sarah nodded to herself again, and Thomas had the distinct impression she was making mental lists of changes and improvements. But what would their living arrangements be? Thomas had spent considerable time worrying about this particular aspect of their marriage. He had prepared the spare bedroom for Sarah, assuming she would prefer privacy, but he wasn't certain of the expectations. In the end, he simply showed her to the room he'd readied and left the decision to her. "This is your room. he said, opening the door to reveal a simple but clean space with a good bed, a dresser, and a window that looked out over the garden plot. Unless you prefer other arrangements. Sarah examined the room carefully, then looked back at Thomas with what might have been relief. She nodded her acceptance and set down her carpetbags with a decisive air that suggested the matter was settled to her satisfaction. The first days of their marriage passed in a rhythm that was both strange and strangely comforting. Thomas would rise before dawn, as had been his habit since the war, and find that Sarah was already up, moving quietly through the kitchen, preparing breakfast. She seemed to understand intuitively that he preferred to eat in silence, needed time to steel himself for the day ahead without the pressure of conversation or social expectation. Their meals were simple but well prepared. Sarah proved to be an excellent cook, able to transform basic ingredients into satisfying fare that reminded Thomas of home-cooked meals from before his world had been shattered by war. She watched him carefully during those first few days, noting his preferences, adjusting portions and seasonings until she'd learned exactly how he liked things prepared. During the day, while Thomas worked the land, tending to his small herd of cattle, repairing fences, maintaining equipment, Sarah threw herself into transforming the house. The changes started small. Curtains appeared at windows, sewn from fabric she must have brought with her or purchased during one of her rare trips to town. Simple cotton in cheerful patterns that softened the harsh angles of rooms and let in filtered light while maintaining privacy. She cleaned with a thoroughness that went beyond mere housekeeping. Thomas would come in from the fields to find that she had somehow managed to make the familiar rooms feel different, warmer, more welcoming. She rearranged furniture to create conversational spaces, even though neither of them used them for conversation. She placed books on tables, added small decorative touches that he slowly realized must have been her own possessions, carefully hoarded over the years. But it was more than just the physical changes. Sarah's presence filled the house in ways Thomas hadn't expected. There was something deeply peaceful about knowing she was there, moving through the rooms with quiet efficiency, creating order and comfort without demanding anything from him in return. Thomas found himself looking forward to evening meals, not because he was particularly hungry, but because it meant time spent in Sarah's calm presence. She would serve the food and take her seat across from him, and they would eat together in companionable silence. Sometimes he caught her watching him with those thoughtful dark eyes, and he began to wonder what she was thinking behind that serene expression. After 2 weeks of this routine, Thomas made a discovery that surprised him. He realized that the constant tension in his shoulders had begun to ease. The hypervigilant awareness that had plagued him since returning from war, the need to know where every exit was, to position himself where he could see potential threats, to startle at unexpected sounds, had diminished to manageable levels. Sarah's very stillness seemed to be medicine for his fractured nerves. In her presence, he could begin to believe that not every shadow held danger, that not every sound meant incoming artillery. The house felt like a sanctuary in ways it never had when he lived there alone. It was during the 3rd week that Thomas began to notice other things about his wife. Despite her size, she moved with surprising grace, her large hands proving to be remarkably skilled at delicate work. He would find evidence of her needlework throughout the house. Carefully mended tiers in curtains, reinforced buttons on his shirts, decorative stitching on dish towels that transformed purely functional items into something approaching art. And there was something in her eyes that he couldn't quite interpret. Intelligence, certainly. Watchfulness, but also something else. A depth of observation that suggested she was constantly taking in information, processing it, understanding far more than her silence might suggest. One evening, as they sat at the table after a particularly satisfying meal of roast chicken and vegetables from the garden Sarah had begun to tend, Thomas found himself really looking at his wife, for the first time since their wedding day. Her brown hair, always neatly arranged, caught the lamplight and revealed golden highlights he hadn't noticed before. Her skin was clear and healthy, with a natural color that spoke of time spent outdoors. And her face, while round and soft, had a symmetry that was genuinely pleasant to look at. "You're a good cook," he said suddenly, the words surprising him as much as they clearly surprised her. It was the first purely personal comment he'd made since their marriage, the first acknowledgement of her as anything more than a provider of services. Sarah's eyes widened slightly, and a faint blush colored her cheeks. She nodded in acknowledgement, then gestured toward the kitchen with a motion that somehow conveyed both thanks and a question about whether he'd like more. "No, I'm satisfied," Thomas said, and realized it was true in more ways than one. For the first time in years, he felt genuinely satisfied, not just fed, but content. But it was 3 weeks later that everything changed in a way Thomas never could have anticipated. He had been sleeping poorly that particular night, not from nightmares for once, but from a restlessness he couldn't quite explain. The house felt different somehow, charged with an energy he couldn't identify. Around midnight, he gave up on sleep and decided to get a glass of water from the kitchen. As he made his way down the hallway, padding barefoot on the wooden floors, he became aware of a sound he'd never heard in his house before. It was coming from the direction of Sarah's room, but her door was closed, and the sound was so soft he almost thought he was imagining it. Then he realized what he was hearing, and his blood turned to ice water in his veins. Someone was singing. Thomas froze in the hallway, his heart hammering against his ribs. The voice was female, clear and sweet, drifting through Sarah's door like smoke. But that was impossible. Sarah was mute, had been mute since childhood. Everyone knew that. The singing continued, and Thomas found himself drawn toward it, despite every instinct screaming at him to retreat. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, something he didn't recognize, but that seemed to reach into his chest and squeeze his heart. The voice was pure and trained, the kind of voice that belonged on stage or in cathedral choirs, not in the bedroom of a supposedly mute ranch wife. He crept closer to Sarah's door, which stood slightly ajar, and peered through the crack. What he saw stopped his breath entirely. Sarah sat in the chair by her window, moonlight streaming through the glass to illuminate her face. Her hair was down, falling in waves around her shoulders, and she wore a simple white nightgown that somehow made her look younger, softer. But it was her face that shocked him most, animated in a way he'd never seen, alive with emotion as she sang to the night. Her voice soared and dipped with professional control, moving through what he realized was a complex area in a language he didn't recognize, Italian perhaps, or French. The technical skill was undeniable, but more than that was the pure emotion she poured into every note. This wasn't someone who had once been able to sing. This was someone who was a singer, trained and practiced and utterly gifted. Thomas stood transfixed, his mind reeling with implications. If Sarah could sing like this, if she had always been able to sing like this, then what else had she hidden? What else had the town gotten wrong about the supposedly simple-minded mute girl who nobody bothered to really see? The song ended, and Sarah began another, this one in English. A folk ballad about lost love and redemption that she delivered with such aching beauty that Thomas felt tears pricking at his eyes for the first time since the war. Her voice wrapped around the words like silk, finding meanings in familiar lyrics that he'd never noticed before. As the second song drew to a close, Sarah's gaze drifted toward the window, and her eyes met Thomas's through the crack in the door. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, he shocked and wondering, she startled but not afraid. Then, Sarah rose gracefully from her chair and crossed to the door, opening it fully to face her husband. In the moonlight streaming through her window, She looked like a different person entirely. Not the heavy, silent woman who served his meals and mended his clothes, but someone mysterious and powerful and utterly compelling. "You can speak," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't a question. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, studying his face in the dim light of the hallway. When she finally spoke, her voice was just as clear and beautiful as her singing voice had been, with a slight accent he couldn't place that suggested education far beyond what anyone in Cedar Creek possessed. "Yes, Thomas, I can speak. I've always been able to speak. But why?" The question burst from him with more force than he'd intended. "Why does everyone think? Why have you let everyone believe?" Sarah's expression grew sad, and she gestured for him to come into her room. Thomas hesitated. Propriety dictated that a man shouldn't enter his wife's bedroom uninvited, even if they were married. But curiosity won over convention, and he stepped across the threshold. "Sit," Sarah said gently, indicating the chair by the window. "And I'll tell you a story that no one in Cedar Creek knows." Thomas sat, his mind spinning with questions and possibilities, while Sarah settled on the edge of her bed, her hands folded in her lap with the same composed dignity she always displayed. "My name," she began, "is not Sarah Whitmore. It's Sarah Elena Montclair, and I was born in New Orleans to a family that owned one of the largest plantations in Louisiana. My father was a wealthy man who sent me to the finest schools in Europe, where I studied music and languages, and all the accomplishments expected of a young lady of quality." Thomas felt his mouth fall open. This revelation was so far beyond what he'd expected that he could barely process it. "I can speak 4 languages fluently," Sarah continued, "and I trained as an opera singer at the Royal Conservatory in Paris. I was quite good, actually. Good enough that I was offered contracts with opera houses in London and Vienna." "What happened?" Thomas managed to ask. Sarah's expression darkened. "The war. When the federal troops came through our parish, they burned everything. The house, the fields, the slave quarters. My parents died in the fire, along with my younger brother. I barely escaped with my life." She paused, looking out the window at the night sky. "I was 19 years old, alone in the world with nothing but the clothes on my back and the knowledge that everything I'd ever known was gone forever. I made my way north, thinking I could use my musical training to support myself. But," another pause, longer this time, "but I discovered that a young woman alone in the world, especially one from the South, faced difficulties. Men assumed I was available for certain kinds of employment. When I tried to find legitimate work, I was either turned away for being a Confederate or offered positions that had nothing to do with my actual skills." Thomas began to understand. "So you came west." "Eventually, I worked my way across the country, taking whatever honest work I could find. But everywhere I went, my accent marked me as foreign, as different, and my figure." She gestured to herself with a self-deprecating smile. "Well, men either wanted to take advantage of what they saw as an easy target, or they ignored me entirely. When I reached Cedar Creek 5 years ago, I was exhausted, tired of fighting to be seen as anything other than what people assumed I was. Mrs. Henderson needed help with her boarding house, and I needed somewhere safe to disappear. So I became Sarah Whitmore, the poor mute girl who'd lost her voice to childhood fever. It was easier than being Sarah Elena Montclair, the displaced Southern belle, with an operatic voice and a head full of useless accomplishments." Thomas stared at her, beginning to understand the magnitude of what she'd revealed. "You've been pretending to be mute for 5 years." "It's not entirely pretending," Sarah said softly. "In all the ways that matter to the people of this town, I am mute. They have no interest in hearing what I might have to say. They see a full, simple woman who can serve their needs without bothering them with opinions or demands. And that was actually a relief for a while. But the singing. Sarah smiled, and for the first time since he'd known her, it was a smile without reservation or guardedness. Music is like breathing for me. I can't not sing any more than I could stop my heart from beating. But I only do it at night when I think no one can hear. It's my way of staying connected to who I really am underneath all the pretending. Thomas felt as though the world had tilted on its axis. Everything he thought he knew about his wife, about their marriage, about the reasons she'd accepted his proposal, all of it needed to be reconsidered in light of this revelation. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked. Sarah's expression grew gentle. "Because you've given me something I hadn't had in years. Safety. Not just physical safety, but the safety of being accepted without demands or expectations. You asked for my silence, and I gave it gladly, because it meant I could exist without performance, without having to be anything other than what you needed me to be." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes earnest in the moonlight. "But Thomas, I've been watching you for 3 weeks now. I've seen how the war damaged you, how you startle at loud noises, how you position yourself where you can see all the exits. I recognize trauma when I see it, because I carry plenty of my own." "And?" Thomas prompted, though he wasn't sure he was ready for whatever she might say next. "And I think we might be able to help each other heal, if you're willing to know who I really am, instead of who you thought you married." "Your voice is very beautiful," said Thomas. "Why do you hide such a talent? When people see me, they only see a fat woman. Even if they heard my voice, they would mock me. They would say Fat Sarah is singing." Thomas sat next to Sarah. "I won't mock you. I loved your voice. I haven't felt this peaceful since the war." After that night, everything changed. Sarah continued to sing at night, and Thomas listened. The woman's voice was healing his war traumas. As days passed, Sarah began to speak more. She told Thomas stories, taught him songs. A real bond formed between them. A month later, Thomas said something to Sarah. "Would you like to sing in town?" Sarah was frightened. "They'll make fun of me. I'll be with you, and I don't care what they say anymore." On Sunday, Sarah sang in church. At the first note, everyone fell silent. At the second note, their mouths hung open. At the third note, they shed tears. Sarah's voice was so beautiful that the entire town was enchanted. Nobody could think of mocking her. They just listened in admiration. From that day on, Sarah became the most respected woman in town. People would line up to listen to her sing. But most importantly, the love between Thomas and Sarah was growing. Thomas had seen Sarah's beauty, not just physical, but the beauty of her heart. A year later, the town threw the couple an anniversary party. Sarah sang. Thomas watched her with pride. "I don't love you because you're heavy," said Thomas that night. "I love you for the greatness of your heart." Sarah cried. For the first time, someone truly understood her. 2 years later, Sarah became pregnant. When their child was born, Sarah raised him singing lullabies. Thomas had also completely recovered from his war memories. The townspeople now called them the music family. Sarah led the church choir, and Thomas was her biggest supporter. And Sarah never went on a diet. Thomas loved her as she was, and she had accepted herself as she was. Years later, Sarah's songs became famous throughout the state, but she still continued to live on Thomas's quiet ranch, singing to him. Thomas's war trauma had completely healed. Sarah's voice had been medicine for him, and Sarah no longer hid herself. The beautiful thing about their story was this: 2 wounded people had healed each other through the power of silence and music. If this story inspired you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel, because we have many more incredible stories from the depths of history waiting for you. See you in the next video.